After the Carlos Takam fight and the Joseph Parker fight, I predicted that Anthony Joshua's popularity would start to wane. Now, the reason I predicted this is, well, several reasons. One of them was because the novelty of having a British heavyweight world champion would start to wear off a little bit, because the way Matchroom and AJ were milking the situation, and I'm not knocking them for milking it. At the end of the day, boxing is a business, it's prize fighting. But the way they were milking it, putting on these stadium fights, I always felt like the stadium fights were a bit of a gimmick. Because if you're at Wembley Stadium and, like most people, you're in the cheap seats, you're going to need a pair of binoculars to actually see what's going on in the ring. Now, obviously you can see, but you're very, very far away from the ring. And you're probably going to be watching most of the fight on the big screen rather than watching it with your own eyes in the ring. And I thought, it's only a matter of time before the people who are attending these AJ Stadium fights are going to realize that rather than stumping up the money to get a decent view, which is going to cost you hundreds or thousands of pounds, it's actually just better to pay the £20 and watch it on pay-per-view at home. You get a much better view. Now, I know that when it comes to attending a sporting event like that, it's about experiencing the atmosphere, and you don't really get a sense. Well, you get a sense of the atmosphere watching on television, but you can't really get the full experience unless you're actually there. But again, I always felt like that was eventually going to wear off, because there are only so many people who will actually go and watch a fight live. The vast majority will prefer to watch it on television. And so those people who have been going to the AJ Stadium fights, how long before they start to get tired of it? You understand what I'm saying? So I always felt like the stadium fight situation was, had a limited shelf life. And AJ as a fighter, even though he was exciting on the way up to becoming heavyweight champion and his first few defenses, he's not Mike Tyson exciting. And even Mike Tyson, going into the fight with Buster Douglas, had started to experience a bit of a drop-off in terms of the interest in his fights, because Mike Tyson was so dominant as a heavyweight champion that people saw his defenses against the likes of Buster Douglas as a foregone conclusion. Very few people, almost nobody, felt like Douglas had any chance of even lasting the distance, much less winning. So there was a decline in the viewership for some of Mike Tyson's fights because of the inevitability, the perceived inevitability of the outcome. Now, Anthony Joshua, as I say, not as dynamic as Mike Tyson, not as exciting, but still an exciting heavyweight. But one thing that Mike Tyson had, aside from ability in the ring, certain abilities in the ring, is he had a personality which captivated the public. People were intrigued by the mind of Mike Tyson because he was a troubled soul. Now, Anthony Joshua doesn't have the type of interesting personality that Mike Tyson had. Now, I say interesting. Some people, a lot of people find Mike Tyson interesting. Other people don't find him particularly interesting. They just found him obnoxious. Whatever the case may be, Mike Tyson was anything but dull. Yes. Whether you found him obnoxious or whether you found him interesting and intriguing, This was not a dull character. Anthony Joshua, on the other hand, it's all very corporate. It's all very superficial. There's not much there's not much interest in there to most people when you compare him to a Muhammad Ali, a Mike Tyson, and even, dare I say it, a Tyson Fury. And that is one of the other reasons why I'm confident that my prediction of Anthony Joshua's popularity starting to wane is actually coming to fruition. Because when Anthony Joshua was beating Vladimir Klitschko, Carlos Takam, Joseph Parker, Tyson Fury wasn't a factor in the heavyweight division. He was on a hiatus. He'd had his license suspended, and he was unsure whether he would ever return to the ring. But now that he has returned to the ring, now that he's got himself into the position of being WBC World Heavyweight Champion and putting on a dominant display against Deontay Wilder in the rematch, and he's also got the dominant display against Vladimir Klitschko when he won the world title, or world titles, plural. People now look at that, a lot of people, and say, well, yeah, AJ's had more world title fights, but he's never looked as dominant against elite opponents as Tyson Fury has. So that's taken a lot of the shine away from AJ, is the Tyson Fury factor. AJ, through his association with certain, let's just say, movements, has also turned a certain percentage of the public off him and away from him. And they've moved into the Tyson Fury camp, a lot of them. And there's also the element of glory supporting in boxing. Now, when Anthony Joshua fought Joseph Parker, I noticed a lot of the fair weather fans, and I'm not disrespecting them for being fair weather fans. At the end of the day, it's just boxing. The vast majority of people don't know Anthony Joshua personally or Tyson Fury, so if they want to switch from being AJ fans one day and then being Fury fans the next day, I've got no issue with that. If they're doing it just out of, glory supporting, well, good luck to you. But when AJ fought Joseph Parker, I noticed a lot of these fair weather fans, these glory supporters, they were very disappointed in AJ's performance. They were disappointed that they bought the pay-per-view. They were saying, if he keeps boxing like that, I don't think I'll buy his pay-per-views anymore. This is the kind of things I heard people saying. And I thought to myself, well, what happens if AJ loses? What happens if he gets badly defeated? Can you imagine what these fair weather fans are going to do at that point? Will that happen? There was a perception for a long time among casuals that there was nobody out there that could challenge AJ. There's nobody out there that could come close to beating him, much less actually beat him. Now, when he fought Klitschko, that shattered that particular paradigm to some extent, or at least cracked it. And then when he lost to Ruiz, it was shattered into a million pieces. Because not only was he beaten badly, but he was beaten badly by somebody who, in the eyes of casuals, should never be able to do that. A guy who could never defeat AJ in any kind of weightlifting competition or running competition or pretty much any sport or athletic endeavor, AJ would come out on top over Andy Ruiz. But boxing is different. Fighting is different. And this is something that a lot of casuals don't understand. It's not a bodybuilding contest. So it wasn't just the defeat. It wasn't just the manner of the defeat, but it was who AJ lost to. That changed a lot. in terms of Anthony Joshua's popularity. I know the rematch did great numbers on pay-per-view and all that kind of stuff because people like a redemption story. But people don't believe in Anthony Joshua. They don't have the kind of confidence in him now that they had prior to that Andy Ruiz loss. And as I say, a lot of the other things that AJ has involved himself with outside of the ring and the success of Tyson Fury. You know, people look at Fury and what he did to Wilder and they say, okay, as a fan, this is a fighter I can rely on more. He's not going to let me down or disappoint me if I put my faith and hope in him, because look, when he steps up to elite level, he's got the goods. You see? So there are a number of different factors, but I do believe that I was right in my prediction that Anthony Joshua's popularity is on the wane. He's still very popular, don't get it twisted, but he doesn't have the momentum behind him that he used to have. Now, I say all that to talk about his upcoming fight on the weekend against mandatory challenger Pulev. There seems to be no excitement at all for this fight. In the early days of Anthony Joshua's world title reign, there was lots of excitement, even against opponents like Dominic Breazeale. That was his first defense, I believe. Yeah, fought Charles Martin to win the title, then Breazeale. Was that his first defense? I think it was. Klitschko, obviously. There was far more excitement for those fights. Even the Takam fight beforehand, there was far more excitement for those fights than there seems to be for this Pulev fight. And he's only one fight removed from the rematch of Andy Ruiz that did great numbers on pay-per-view. And this is what I did say. I said it again after the first AJ Ruiz fight. I said, even if AJ beats Ruiz in the rematch, he's never going to be as popular as he was prior to the first Ruiz fight. The rematch might do great numbers because, again, people want to see what's going to happen. It's a compelling storyline. But if he gets past Ruiz for his regular defenses, there's not going to be the same viewing figures and there's not going to be the same excitement for his regular defenses as there used to be. And I think you're seeing that now. I mean, we haven't seen the pay-per-view numbers, obviously. We don't know what's going to happen in the Pulev fight yet. But I think you're seeing from the public reaction there just isn't the same anticipation for an Anthony Joshua fight as there used to be. I mean, back in the days, as John Fury said, Anthony Joshua could fight a dog in the road and it would sell out Wembley Stadium. There was loads of excitement for it. So it wasn't really about the opponents at all back in the days. And I say back in the days like a couple years ago. But now that Anthony Joshua doesn't have the confidence of the public that he used to have, who the opponent is far more important in terms of whether they can sell the fight. The public obviously don't know, most of the public, the casuals, they don't know who Pulev is. To them, he's just some random Eastern European guy. Now, obviously, with the situation at the moment, AJ is only going to have, I think, 1,000 fans in the arena. But even the pay-per-view figures, I'm not expecting them to be particularly great. And all the talk at the moment from AJ, if you've noticed, or a lot of the talk, let me not say all the talk, but a lot of the talk from AJ is about Tyson Fury. A lot of talk from his promoter, Eddie Hearn, is about Tyson Fury and getting the Tyson Fury fight done. And of course, understandably, people are saying, well, haven't we been here before? Isn't this the same situation as back in 2019 when AJ was talking about Deontay Wilder not Andy Ruiz. And he ended up coming unstuck because his focus should have been on the man in front of him rather than the man behind Andy Ruiz in Deontay Wilder. I say behind as in, beyond. Well, I don't think AJ will be as complacent against Kubrat Pulev as he was against Andy Ruiz. Not at all. I think the memory of the Ruiz defeat is far too fresh in his mind to make that same mistake twice. And it's not like he didn't train hard for the Andy Ruiz fight, but he took his game to another level in terms of preparation, in terms of strategy, and in terms of, losing weight. He lost a lot of muscle between between the first and the second Ruiz fight because he realized that he was too bulky. All that extra bulk, that extra muscle through resistance training was putting a toll on his lungs and his heart. He wasn't able to move around as well at that weight. So, yeah, he took his boxing game to the next level in the Andy Ruiz rematch. And so I think he will have continued along that path since the Andy Ruiz rematch, in focusing more on boxing rather than being Mr. CrossFit. So the Kubrat Pulev fight itself, I think it's a fairly straightforward equation in my head. If Anthony Joshua decides to box with Kubrat Pulev, he's going to have problems. I'm not going to say he won't have success as well boxing. Yeah, he can have some success of his own, but Kubrat Pulev is a very good long-range boxer. He's got the old classical Eastern European style, and he's mastered that style. It's very difficult to get to him if you want to box his fight at long range, exchanging jabs and all this kind of stuff, low volume. Kubrat Pulev loves all that. His jab is probably the best in the heavyweight division. It's always been one of the best. At this point, it might be the best jab in the heavyweight division. It's very powerful. And I think that whether Anthony Joshua does it early or does it late, he's going to need to take the fight. I've been saying this all along. He's going to need to take the fight to Kubrat Pulev. Not necessarily recklessly, but he's going to have to be a bit aggressive. He's going to have to get into mid-range or on the inside against Pulev to get the job done. That's what I think. If he's just looking to go out there and box like he did against Ruiz or box like he did against Joseph Parker, I think that is playing into Kubrat Pulev's hands. So we'll see what happens. But the main point I wanted to make in this video is that I believe Anthony Joshua's popularity is starting to wane. One of the things I forgot to mention is the nature of his performances. Because the Joseph Parker fight, as I say, a lot of people were disappointed with his performance there because it wasn't exciting. It wasn't what they were used to from AJ. And I said at the time, is AJ going to move forward and try and be Klitschko 2.0? Because if he is, he's going to lose a lot of support. It's not like he has a Muhammad Ali or even a Tyson Fury type personality to fall back on. Because when Tyson Fury boxes a boring fight, or when Muhammad Ali would box a boring fight, they at least had a colorful personality. They'd do showboating in the ring, talk a lot outside the ring, and they could kind of get away with some boring performances because of their personalities were so colorful. But AJ doesn't have that. And following the Ruiz fight, the rematch that is, again, I was saying, is this how AJ is going to fight moving forward? Because if he's going to fight like this every time, he's going to lose support. Yeah, they let him do it. And I'm talking about the fans, right? the majority of them, of the AJ fans, the casuals, they let him off for that Ruiz rematch because it was all about just getting the win. But moving forward, I'm not speaking for all of the AJ fans. I'm just saying a lot of them, a large percentage of them. If AJ keeps fighting like that and he's not as exciting and dynamic as he used to be, they're going to go off him. So in the Pulev fight, it's not just about winning. If AJ hopes to maintain his popularity or increase it, it's not just about winning, but it's the way that he wins. He has to look spectacular. He has to look convincing. Now, from a boxing perspective, he doesn't necessarily have to win convincingly or easily. And what I mean by that is Anthony Joshua is still learning. He's still improving. If he goes in there against Kubrat Pulev and he tries to box with him, and he's coming off second best, and it's a very nip and tuck fight, but Pulev maybe has the edge in a lot of people's eyes. He's doing better than people expect. And Anthony Joshua is then maybe behind, maybe he gets cut or something. Late in the fight, he puts it on Pulev and takes him out of there. A lot of people are going to look at that and say, well, that was a disappointing performance. How's this guy going to beat Tyson Fury when he struggled with Kubrat Pulev? But I would look at it like that's a good learning experience. If he was to fight Kubrat Pulev again, for example, he wouldn't wait until the 10th round. He wouldn't try to have a boxing match with him. He'd instead go in there and put it on him early in the fight and maybe be able to take him out early. You see it. So the Pulev fight, I'm looking at it as not just a mandatory defense, but also an opportunity to learn and gain more experience, which could stand him in good stead in the future. And again, all this is assuming AJ wins. So, yeah. Kubrat Pulev has no inside game at all. He's 39 years of age. It's outside or nothing for Pulev. On the inside, he doesn't do much other than rabbit punch and hold. But he is very physically strong. Kubrat Pulev weighs from the mid 240s up to the low 250s. And he's natural at that size. He's not like AJ, who pumps himself up with loads of weights and protein shakes to get up to 250 when he was boxing at that kind of weight. Pulev is a naturally big man. I was explaining this to somebody else when it comes to Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce weighs what, in the high 250s or 260s? He's a huge man. Joe Joyce is not pumped up with weights like AJ. The muscle mass that Joe Joyce has, this is natural muscle mass. Through normal boxing training, I'm sure he does a bit of weights here and there, resistance training, but nowhere near to the extent that AJ was doing. When he fought Takam and he was like the Incredible Hulk, the amount of weight training AJ has to do to get up to that kind of size? Even for the first Ruiz fight, what was he, 248 or something? So when you bulk yourself up with loads of weightlifting, it takes a toll on your heart and lungs, because your heart and lungs were not designed to carry all that excess muscle on your body. Whereas a guy like Joe Joyce, whose muscle mass is natural. Joe Joyce is just a naturally big guy. Joe Joyce is naturally much heavier than Anthony Joshua. Heavier, more muscle mass, probably denser bones. He's got a big head, like a large cranium. He's just a naturally bigger, more, dense and heavy person than Anthony Joshua. And that's why he's able to maintain stamina and he can move around all over the place, despite the fact that he weighs as much as he does. So this is why, particularly for heavyweights, it's important to fight at your natural weight. You do your boxing training. I'm not saying you're not supposed to do any, of course you do strength and conditioning, but you don't become a bodybuilder. You don't start lifting and lifting and lifting because you're trying to put on 10 pounds of muscle. No, you shouldn't be ever trying to put on 10 pounds of muscle or 15 pounds of muscle. No. It's all about what's functional for boxing. It's not about a bench press competition or a bicep curl competition or a deadlift competition. That's not what boxing is. Anyway, AJ is still learning on the job. And I think the Pulev fight can be a learning experience. Pulev, that's what I was saying. I lost my train of thought. Pulev is physically strong, naturally physically strong. He's got good stamina. And on the inside, you know, I've been talking about AJ, if he's going to win the fight, having to take it to Pulev on the inside and at mid-distance. That might not necessarily be easy because Pulev is quite good at wrapping you up when he wants to. He's a physically strong man. So that might be a tiring process for AJ, you know, having to wrap him up. Lennox Lewis is widely regarded as the greatest British heavyweight of all time and one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, period. And people often scoff at comparisons between Anthony Joshua and Lennox Lewis. They believe Lewis was far superior to Anthony Joshua, and maybe he was. Time will tell. But as somebody who grew up watching Lennox Lewis and being a fan of Lennox Lewis back in the 1990s, I can tell you that Lewis was ridiculed, heavily criticized, and very few people believed in him, especially after he lost to Oliver McCall. Even after the Bruno fight, there was a lot of skepticism, and when he lost to McCall, he was written off. Oh, he's just a chinny Brit, can't fight. Even a lot of British people turned against him. And he was never that popular with British people anyway, even prior to the McCall loss. There was the hardcore British boxing fans. They tended to support Lennox Lewis, but the wider public were not really big fans of him. It took a long time. It was only at the end of Lewis's career, really, the final couple years, where he really started to get respect and recognition. So you always have to bear that in mind when you're seeing people comparing AJ to Lewis and being very dismissive of AJ. Well, they were very dismissive of Lewis for most of his career as well. Those same people, if they had been around watching boxing in the 90s, they would have been dismissive of Lennox Lewis, the majority of them. Oh yeah, because he's talking about personality types. That personality type is going to be dismissive and skeptical of fighters for the tiniest little thing. That's how people like that are. They don't view things holistically. They're very reactionary and in the moment. So Lennox Lewis not only lost a couple times by knockout, devastating knockout to Oliver McCall and Hasim Ratman, but Lennox Lewis also had unconvincing performances. I mean, the Frank Bruno fight was one of them. He also fought a guy called Zelko Mavrovich, and he had a tough time in that fight. The Ray Mercer fight, he had a tough time. Shannon Briggs, yeah, he stopped him in 5 or 6 rounds, but it was a fight. You know, Lewis knew he'd been in a fight after that Briggs bout. He had to take some shots in there. The Vitaly Klitschko fight, which was the last fight of his career, that was a tough fight. See, Lewis gets praised these days for being this great boxer. And people say, oh, he was a much better boxer than Anthony Joshua. Much better boxing skills. But Lennox Lewis got outboxed in some fights. He was a great boxer, but he did get outboxed. Frank Bruno was outboxing him. Frank Bruno, of all people, was outboxing Lennox Lewis. And I say of all people because Frank Bruno was slow. He was stiff. He was robotic. Lennox Lewis was taller. more athletic. They both had a similar reach. Lewis was much faster. He was younger than Frank Bruno. So how can it be that Bruno's outboxing him? Well, it happened. Vitaly Klitschko was outboxing him. Ray Mercer wasn't really outboxing Lennox Lewis, but he was certainly giving him a lot of issues with the jab. And I've already mentioned Zeljko Mavrovic. So, as good a boxing skills as Lennox Lewis had, he did get outboxed in some fights. And in the fights where he was getting outboxed, he had to take it to his opponent in order to get the job done. That's what happened in the Vitaly Klitschko fight. He came out trying to box with Vitaly Klitschko. It wasn't working. So in the end, Manny Stewart said, you got to take it to him. Forget about boxing. You got to fight this guy. And that's what Lewis did. Went out there, took the bull by the horns, started to fight him, managed to cut up his face, and he won the fight. It had to be stopped because Vitaly's face was an absolute mess. So if Anthony Joshua has to go out and do something like that, where he's getting outboxed and he takes it to somebody and manages to win, in my mind, that is not a disastrous performance. I've seen Lennox Lewis do that. You understand? I'm seeing things in context. So I'm interested in this Pulev fight. Am I excited? No. Do I understand why a lot of people don't want to pay £25? Absolutely. But as a boxing fan, especially a boxing fan who specializes in heavyweight boxing, it's still an intriguing fight to me. I still want to see how AJ deals with this guy. Now, Pulev is getting on in age and he's probably not what he used to be. So it's understandable that AJ is the favorite. But if Pulev can summon one performance where he can perform to the level or close to the level that he was at a few years ago, then I'm expecting AJ to have some problems before he finally gets the win. And before I close out, you do have this issue of a rematch clause being in the contract. And I made a video about this. I said, I think it's scandalous that now you've got mandatory challengers having to sign up to, contracts that have rematch clauses in them, because ordinarily mandatory challengers are not obligated to fight a rematch if they beat the champion. That's one of the perks of becoming mandatory. That's one of the reasons that you fight to become the mandatory, because you get a guaranteed purse split and you also get to sail off into the sunset if you beat the champion. You don't have to fight him again. Now, Eddie Hearn was questioned about this recently. I think it was a Boxing Social interview where he was questioned about this mandatory thing, the rematch clause. And Eddie Hearn looked very uncomfortable when he was asked that question. He said, it's standard, industry standard, that when you're dealing with a big star, there's a rematch in all contracts. Yeah, but it's not standard to have a rematch clause for a mandatory challenger. That is not standard at all. Now, he tried to word it in a way whereby he's talking about specific fighters, the AJs, the superstar fighters. They have rematch clauses even for mandatories. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a travesty. It shouldn't be that way. And he's acting as though the challenger likes it. I'm going to call BS on that. If Kubrat Pulev were to beat Anthony Joshua, let's say he beats him on points, he doesn't want a rematch. Why should he? These people are taking rematches. I mean, in that interview, Eddie Hearn talked about he talked about fighters, mandatory challengers, signing a rematch clause because they're going to make so much money from the rematch. So, you know, there's an incentive there for them to do it. But he also talked about, I think it was Vasyl Lomachenko. I can't remember. I think it was Lomachenko. Was it Lomachenko? It was some fighter, some world champion who had a mandatory. And they said that unless the mandatory challenger agrees to sign for the rematch clause, then they'll vacate. And that mandatory can fight for the vacant belt. So they were taking away the financial and saying, no. You either sign for this rematch clause or, you know, you're not going to fight this particular fighter at all. And you're not going to get this payday. So, you know, you want to go fight another contender for the vacant belt for a fraction of the money that you'd make against the champion? Be my guest. So, yeah, I think that this is something, and I know it's not going to happen because money talks and BS walks. But I wish the sanctioning bodies would crack down on this, because at the end of the day, the sanctioning bodies can simply refuse to sanction the bout if there's a rematch clause for a mandatory defense. They can say, no, that's against our rules. You're not allowed to put rematch clauses in a contract for a mandatory bout. And that's it. Yeah. That's how you allow the natural flux in any boxing division, is when the mandatory challenger fights their way up to that position. If they then beat the champion, they start a new legacy. They start a new lineage. They go off and have their own career. They're not tied to the fighter they've beaten and to the machine behind that fighter. In this instance, Eddie Hearn, Matchroom, Sky, DAZN. It's a big machine. You beat the guy once, you got to beat him twice. I mean, they weren't in your favor the first time. They're not going to be in your favor the next time in terms of the officials and all that kind of stuff. So, anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Long video, man. Just looked at how long I've been talking for. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below about all I discussed there. If you'd like to access all my boxing content advert-free and enjoy the convenience of listening via a podcast app with the option to download in high-quality MP3, then consider joining me on Patreon. In addition to the aforementioned perks, you'll also gain access to exclusive weekly live stream Q&A sessions and hangouts, as well as uncensored, no-holds-barred uploads which are too blue for YouTube. This includes my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Boxing Extra. There's no contract, there's no commitment, it's only £2.50 a month, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of hardcore boxing enthusiasts by signing up with me here on Patreon today.